reading today is from the New King James Version, Habakkuk chapter 3, verses 1 and 2. A prayer of Habakkuk the prophet on Shigionoth. O Lord, I have heard your speech and was afraid. O Lord, revive your work in the midst of the years. In the midst of the years, make it known. In wrath, remember mercy.
Well, good morning. Oh, that's nice. Have you seen this week? I wasn't aware. But there you go. Feel out of place now, I think. I hope. They talk about young at heart. Perhaps I'm a little old at heart sometimes. Well, over the last couple of weeks, we've been looking at and following along with Habakkuk. Now, oh yes, I must say, I say Habakkuk. Now I'm saying both. I say Habakkuk. Don't hate me for that. I know I'm in the minority. We've been following along with Habakkuk and God's discussion or discourse over the last couple of weeks. And today we get to see kind of where all of this lands in terms of Habakkuk's response to what he's learned. So just to remind you of some context here, Habakkuk lives in a time where those people in Judah have turned from God. There's evil in Judah. There's much evil outside of Judah. And Habakkuk, knowing God's character, God is a good, just, righteous God, seems to be doing nothing about this. So he's struggling to reconcile God's character with what he sees. So he goes to God and he asks God, what's up with that? You know, although in perhaps more delicate words. And God graciously responds and tells him, no, you're right. I am a good God, a just God, but I'm not idle. I am indeed working. I'm just working in the background. And indeed, I'm raising up this other nation, the Chaldeans, to come in to destroy Israel and to take Israel all those people in Judah into exile, to chastise them and to turn their hearts back to me. So with his first query answered, that's great, but it causes another question to come up in him. He says, well, hang on. You're clearly dealing with Israel's sin, okay, rightly so, but are you going to let them off the hook? Why are you only dealing with ours and you're not also dealing with theirs? They're even worse than us, in fact. But God, again, graciously responds to Habakkuk and tells him, no, indeed, I am very aware of the Chaldeans' sin, and in fact, I am a just judge, and everyone will be held to account. And in fact, he tells Habakkuk in such detail, or that he knows and is aware of the Chaldean sin in such detail that he lists those five woes, right? Those five evil characteristics that the Chaldeans have, and the consequence that he will bring upon them for each of those. So God has graciously dealt with Habakkuk's questions and complaints, and now we get to see where he goes from here. So chapter 3 is a little bit different. Just the prayer of Habakkuk is what this chapter is overall called, but it's not just a prayer, it is in fact a psalm as well. So it's a little bit different. It's no longer discourse and dialogue between God and him. So you can see in verse 1, okay, a prayer of Habakkuk the prophet upon Shigionoth. So it's prayer that he's writing here. Now just to clarify, that Shigionoth word, it's a little bit of a mystery. Some people say it's an instrument, some people say it's just the mode or the type of poetry that he's using. It doesn't have any influence on our interpretation of the text though. So it's prayer, but then if you look at the very last verse as well, how he finishes, to the chief singer on my stringed instruments. So this is actually something that is to be sung. So it's a psalm and a hymn. And actually, as you go through, you might even pick up every now and then, there's actually a lot of references to the psalms as well throughout. Now, in order to correctly or to understand the lessons that Habakkuk is trying to teach through this psalm, we need to have a look at the purpose. Why has this actually been written down? Because if this was just a prayer between Habakkuk and God, then it would look probably much the same as the first couple of chapters. That was prayer, that was dialogue between Habakkuk and God. But this is something different, and it has a different purpose. So I'm going to pray. I think I might need it this morning. And then we'll jump in and have a look at this, and then have a look at what he's trying to teach us here. Father, thank you for your love. Thank you for your grace. Thank you for your patience. God, please help me to speak clearly this morning. Please open our hearts and our minds to understand your word and what you're trying to teach us through it. Amen. So, Judah. Judah is about to go into exile. Okay, the Chaldeans are going to come in. They will kill people. They will take people out. They will destroy homes, crops, cities. This will happen. This is what God has told Habakkuk will happen. And now Habakkuk's own faith, because he's just had these two conversations with God, he's gone on a little bit of a journey himself. His own faith has been strengthened and renewed through this process. So Habakkuk's in a good place to stay true and stay firm in his faith of God through all of these hard times that are to come. But the rest of Judah haven't had that experience. In fact, as it says, most people in Judah have actually turned their backs on God. They're not in a good place at all. And if you follow Israel's history, and if you know the covenant between God and Israel as well, you'll know that when Israel followed God, God blesses them. But when Israel turn their back on God, which unfortunately we see happen time and time again, God brings curses upon them. Now, it's not curses just to punish and to beat down, but the curses that he brings are always aimed to turn Israel's heart back to God. Okay, and that is God's purpose here in bringing in the Chaldeans. And it is also Habakkuk's purpose in writing this psalm. Habakkuk is trying to, he's written this down to be sent to people that they may sing and that they may pray and that they may know the lessons that he learned through his discussions with God, that their faith may be strengthened as well before they go into exile. In fact, there's a nice quote here, and I have to squint to see it, from John Calvin that summarizes this really nicely. There is no doubt but that the prophet dictated this form of prayer for his people before they were led into exile, that they might always exercise themselves in the study of religion. Okay? We indeed know that God cannot be rightly and from the heart worshipped, but in faith. Hence, in order to confine the dispersed Israelites within due limits, right, to stop them turning from God, so that they might not fall away from the true religion, the prophet here sets before them the materials of faith and stimulates them to prayer. And we know that our faith cannot be supported in a better way than by the exercise of prayer. And I really liked the language he used as well. He sets before them the materials of faith. Okay, those lessons that he had to learn to strengthen his faith, he now presents before Judah. Okay, think of them as the building blocks, those things that are foundational to our faith. And there's three that we're going to see throughout the passage. The three materials of faith, or three building blocks of faith that we'll discover. And the first we've already actually been talking about a little bit, right? It's prayer. Okay, he starts off by saying this is a prayer. And Habakkuk writes this prayer to stimulate others to prayer. But it's not enough just to simply tell them to pray. Okay, the Jews have probably just at this time found out and discovered that God himself is bringing judgment upon them. So you could only imagine perhaps what some of those prayers might be like. God, how dare you? Right? They might be very arrogant or selfish in nature. That's not the type of prayer that services our faith. So this aims, and Habakkuk aims here to model a prayer for them. Okay? A prayer bathed in humility. Okay? That takes people's focus off of themselves. Okay? And off of their circumstances and focuses them on God. Okay, this is a humble and God-centered prayer that he models for them and gives to them to use themselves. Okay, and you'll see that as we go throughout the text as well. So this is our first and foundational material of faith, or building block of faith. So let's actually have a look then, let's continue on and see what this prayer contains. Verse 2. O Lord, I've heard your speech and was afraid. Habakkuk's just heard twice from God and regarding the judgment that he is bringing upon Judah, and his response, rightly so, is that of fear. Okay, it is a fear of the judgment that God is bringing against sin. And in fact, later on in the chapter, the start of verse 16, he actually describes, or we see a description here of what that fear looks like in him. When I heard, my belly trembled. My lips quivered at the voice. Rottenness entered into my bones, and I trembled in myself. So he's not just a little bit scared here. This shows great terror and fear. But it also shows that he's correctly understood God's judgment. See, if Habakkuk didn't understand God's judgment, okay, he would still be questioning it, right? God, you're meant to be for us. We're your chosen people. Why are you punishing us? Doesn't make sense. But Habakkuk correctly understands the judgment that is coming for Judah's sins. Okay, he knows that they have sinned, and he knows the covenant between God and Israel, and he knows that it is a right and just judgment. And he doesn't try to escape it. But indeed, how does he then respond? He says, O Lord, revive your work in the midst of the years. In the midst of the years make known. In wrath, remember mercy. He doesn't try and weasel his way out of it. He doesn't try to maybe leverage his position as a prophet to try and, ease some of the suffering that might be coming. He accepts the right judgment upon Judah, for it is just. And so what then is he left to do but to cast himself upon God's mercy? See, God is the only one who can save people from his own wrath. Work here, just to clarify as well. Okay, work seems a little bit out of place when he says revive your work, because God has just spent time telling Habakkuk of all the things that he's doing. God is at work here. So why then would he ask God to revive his work? So we see in Psalms and also in Isaiah, actually, there's a number of times where God's people are referred to as God's work or workmanship, or even the planting of his hand. Okay, and that's the same here. We see that when he says revive your work, he's saying revive your people, God. Okay, we've turned our hearts from you. Draw us back to you. Okay, in your wrath, which is coming upon us, remember mercy. Okay, turn our hearts back to you that you might bless us again. See, the fear of God acts like a compass for us. Okay, when we correctly understand sin and how terrible it is, and God's holiness and righteousness and how great he is, you'll correctly understand the judgment that then comes upon it. And so when we turn from God in either direction, okay, we fear what may come because of it. And it orients us back to God. And as we see in the second part, okay, it turns us towards repentance as well, because we know that there's nothing we can do to save ourselves. We rely solely on God to save us. So fear acts as a compass, and it also humbles us and turns us to repentance. Now, we may never experience this kind of threat that Habakkuk is currently experiencing ourselves, but we know that there is a much worse and eternal judgment that comes upon the sins of man. An eternity having the wrath of God poured out against us in hell. That's scary. That's terrifying. And our response should be that of Habakkuk's, to throw ourselves at God's mercy and to throw ourselves into repentance, to turn from that sin towards God. But of course, God being a loving Father, he doesn't just leave us in fear. Do what I say or you'll be punished. Do what I say or you'll be punished. No, see, the fear of God and the fear of his judgment orients us towards God. But then as we seek God and as we know God, and as we know God more and more, we grow to love God more and more. And it's our knowledge and our fear of God that helps us to then step towards growing closer to him and to become more like him. The fear of God shows a true understanding of the terrible nature of sin and a true understanding of God and his holiness and his just righteousness. Okay, and so if you didn't gather, that's our second foundation, our second building block, our second material of faith that Habakkuk presents here to the people of Judah. Okay, he wants their hearts to be turned to God. And so he reminds them that God is to be feared. He is mighty and just. 2 verses down, 17 to go? Hope you bought a packed lunch. No, we'll be all right. Okay, the next section here. Now, the next section is a big section. It's from verses 3 all the way to verse 15. Okay, and in this section, we see that Habakkuk brings to our remembrance, and he recalls a number of different events from throughout Israel's history. Okay, times where he miraculously intervened for Israel. And poetry is wonderful, and it does wonderful things to paint pictures and words. I struggle with poetry a little bit because of that. And so it's a little bit difficult here sometimes, and especially because obviously this was originally written in Hebrew, so then the Hebrew poetry has been translated then into English. And so some of the sections, we can see fairly clearly what he's talking about, sometimes not so much. But we do need to get a good grasp on what all of the events are that he's talking about here, that when we may see the whole picture that he's painting to then understand why. So we're going to be as quick as we can. We're going to go through them. I think there's about 9 of them all up. Okay, and we'll just quickly find out which events he's talking about. What is he actually referencing here and bringing to our minds, okay, so that we can then understand why he's doing this. And just for a bit of fun, just because you're sitting there, okay, this is probably the classroom teacher in me. What we'll do, okay, you can test your recollection of some Old Testament events. I'll read in white the verses, and maybe you can yell out to me if you think you know what he's referencing here. So the first one, God came from Teman, and the Holy One from Mount Paran, Selah. His glory covered the heavens, and the earth was full of his praise. And his brightness was as the light. He had horns coming out of his hand, and there was the hiding of his power. Any thoughts? Oh, silence. Okay, this one. Okay, it's a little bit tricky because he doesn't actually say Mount Sinai here. He references other places, but this is God's revelation of himself on Mount Sinai to Moses and his glory. Now, just to clarify, we see that there's not Mount Sinai reference there. Now, Teman is just generally used to reference the south. So Mount Sinai was in the south of the wilderness. Okay, so just that general area. And as for why he chose to reference Mount Paran instead of Mount Sinai, there's a bit of debate around. Some people say, well, that's a more well-known mountain that's closer to the promised land, and so people make reference to that instead. Other people say it's just a big mountain that was close to Mount Sinai, and so it's one and the same. Okay, it doesn't affect our interpretation of the text. Okay, but this is indeed God's revelation of himself at Mount Sinai, where he taught Israel how to be his chosen people. Okay, the next one. Before him went the pestilence, and the burning coals went forth at his feet. You know, your silence actually makes me feel a little bit better because I struggled with these too. This is the plagues of Egypt. Okay, this is where God came in, plagued Egypt that Pharaoh might let his people out of slavery to be their own people. And the last one on this slide. He stood and measured the earth. He beheld and drove asunder the nations, and the everlasting mountains were scattered. The perpetual hills did bow. His ways are everlasting. I saw the tents of Cushan in affliction, and the curtains of the land of Midian did tremble. So this is where we see God is actually giving the promised land into the hands of the Israelites. Right, he stood and measured the earth. He measured out for the different tribes of Israel those portions that they would have. Okay, and drove asunder the nations. Right, there were other nations living in the promised land at this time. Right, and God with Israel went through and drove out those nations that Israel would take the land that was theirs. And it was to be a land for them forever. So when we see the eternal or the everlasting mountains and the perpetual hills, okay, these were a gift to Israel to last forever. And the land itself obeyed God in this. Now, Cushan and Midian were a couple nations not in the promised land, but nearby the promised land. And they saw what happened as Israel drove the other nations out of the land. And so they rightly were afraid because of that. Perhaps they were wondering if the same was going to happen to them. Doesn't make it easy that they're not chronological either. Hey, let's keep going. Was the Lord displeased against the rivers? Was his anger against the rivers? Was your wrath against the sea, that you rode upon your horses and your chariots of salvation? Your bow was made quite naked, according to the oaths of the tribe, even your word. Selah. We've got the word sea, we've got the word river. Surely someone can have a guess. The Red Sea. Excellent. Okay. And in fact, it's rivers that's referenced there. So we actually see two in one. We've got the crossing of the Red Sea and also the crossing of the Jordan River. Okay, where two different times where God dried up water that they may cross over on dry land. And your bow was made quite naked here as a reference. So bow is just a general reference for weapons, or more generally, strength or might or power. Was made quite naked, so it was made known. So God's might or power was made known here as he took Israel out of Egypt towards the promised land to fulfill the covenant that he made with Abraham. And that's the reference there, according to the oaths of the tribes. That's the covenant. And then we see this other reference here of a river. You cleaved the earth with rivers. Okay, now it's a separate one. So the first two were coming into the wilderness and going out of the wilderness. This happened right in the middle of the wilderness, where we see that the nation of Israel were without water. They had no water. And so God told Moses to draw water from a rock. And he did. And water gushed from the rock to then provide water for the people. Now, this wasn't just a small pool or even a small little oasis. Okay, it says that all of Israel were able to drink and to also drink their, to provide water for their livestock. Now, there's estimates of about 600,000 men alone here, let alone all the other people plus the livestock. So this was a lot of water. This water that's come out of the rock is forming a new river. You cleaved the earth with rivers. And then the last one here. Now, this one's a little bit of a trick question. The mountains saw you and they trembled. The overflowing of the water passed by. The deep uttered his voice and lifted up his hands on high. Now this verse kind of finishes this first section, because the next section goes on a bit of a different tact. And it's actually just a general praising of God for his power over all creation. Right? The mountains obey you. Okay? The waters obey you. Right? Even they, without voices, lift their voice before you and lift up their hands on high. Okay, and then 11 to 15, the last little section here, slightly different tact. Okay, we see a few battles. The sun and moon stood still in their habitation. At the light of your arrows they went, and at the shining of your glittering spear. You marched through the land in indignation, and you threshed the heathen in anger. Now, the first part of there, I only think I know of one reference to that, the sun and the moon standing still. Joshua, good on you. Is that Steve? Thanks, Steve. Steve's on top of it today. So here we see a battle. Okay, this is as Israel is going in and taking over these nations. So they'd already drove out a couple of the nations in the promised land. And obviously the other nations that are around in the promised land see what's happening and they team up. Okay, and there's 5 kings and kingdoms that all join together to come against Israel. And God, being faithful to Israel, tells Israel, don't worry, okay, I'm giving them into your hands. Go up to them. Okay, you will have victory. And so Israel does, and they do have victory. But there's a lot of people here. Okay, they are making their way through the people. They are taking over the people and taking out this massive army, 5 armies in fact. And there are so many people that God actually stops sun and moon in their tracks to allow another around about 12, 24 hours of light to actually continue to fight and to finish the battle. And even beyond that, and it's kind of mentioned here, at the light of your arrows they went. So the sun is shining on God's arrows. Okay, we see here, right, and actually in verse 12 as well, you marched through the land in indignation. You threshed the heathen in anger. God here actually fights for Israel in a very real way. God actually rained down massive hailstones, okay, onto the enemy army such that more actually died from the hailstones than by the sword. Okay, so this was a massive battle, and God, with two very significant miracles, allowed Israel to take victory here. Okay, literally standing the sun and moon in their place. Verse 13 continues this. You went forth for the salvation of your people, even for salvation with your anointed. You wounded the head out of the house of the wicked by discovering the foundation unto the neck. God here went forth. Okay, this was God's victory. Without God, Israel is nothing here. And you wounded the head of the house of the wicked. The wicked here is just anyone who opposes God and God's people. And there's lots of other kings and kingdoms that are still in the promised land yet to be taken over. But these 5 kings, they try and hide to protect themselves. But in fact, Joshua finds them and kills each of them for coming against them. And so he's wounded the head of the house of the wicked. He's wounded the collective bunch of kings, for instance, that rule over these wicked nations. And he wounded them, he destroyed them completely, from foundation to neck. Okay, from bottom to top. 14, we're almost there. You struck through with his staves the head of his villages. They came out as a whirlwind to scatter me. Their rejoicing was as to devour the poor secretly. Just to say that first bit slightly differently, God's come in and he's destroyed people with their own weapons. Okay, this we see in the story of Gideon. Okay, so the previous battle was as Israel took over the promised land. Now Israel have settled in the promised land. Okay, and God actually, as we see the pattern continues, they turn their backs on God, and so God gave them into the hands of the Midian for about 7 years, I think it was. Okay, and Midian would plunder them. They would destroy their crops. They were without food. Okay, it was not a pleasant 7 years, but God, being a good God, and obviously God's goal here is to turn their hearts back to him, does deliver them from Midian eventually. And the Midianites and the Amalekites basically say, okay, we've had our fun, we're going to now come against Israel and destroy them. So God tells Gideon, all right, get up. I want you to get some men and go against these 2 armies. Armies, by the way, whose numbers are described as uncountable and as such as a swarm of locusts. And God says, oh, by the way, only just take a few. 300 will do. Because otherwise you'll think that it's your victory. But no, this is my victory. I'm giving them into your hands. And so 300 men with trumpets in one hand, clay pots in the other, scatter themselves at night throughout the enemy camp, blow their trumpets, smash their clay pots, and God causes a great confusion to come over this army, to the point that they actually end up fighting amongst themselves and wiping themselves out. A mighty victory for God. In verse 15, we've seen this before really. You walked through the sea with your horses, through the heap of great waters. To summarize all this, he brings it back again to the crossing of the Red Sea. Why he does this, I'm not entirely sure. It could just be that it fit poetically in the original language. Or I do know that quite often when God rebukes people and says, well, when they've turned their backs on him, he says, did you forget how I took you out of Egypt and out of the land of slavery? It's almost like his go-to line a little bit. So perhaps Habakkuk is following in his footsteps there and reminding again of where they started and where they ended up. So with all these events, there was lots of events. Let me help summarize them for you here. Okay, and me and my Western mind, I've put them in chronological order as well. Helps me out. Okay, we see all of these events of Israel's history. We see the deliverance from Egypt right at the start with the plagues and the crossing of the Red Sea. We see God's revelation of himself at Mount Sinai, where he taught Israel to be his chosen holy people. We see God provide for them in the wilderness. Okay, we also know not only did he provide water, he also provided manna for them daily as well, food. Then there was the deliverance out of the wilderness into the promised land by crossing the Jordan River, and also giving the nations of the promised land into their hands. And then even after God had fulfilled his promise and brought them into the promised land, he continued to be their God. Okay, and protected them from the hands of those who oppressed them, even after they had settled. So he's painted a very full picture here, basically, of Israel's history from Egypt all the way through, almost you could argue, to now. Okay, a very full picture. And you see all the way through Israel's history that it was God did this to save Israel. God did this for Israel. God did this for Israel. Israel couldn't achieve any of this. Okay? But God in his mighty power did. And so he's starting to draw that to people's mind. But not just that God is powerful and mighty. But he actually, I don't know if you noticed, but in verse 8, where we looked at the Red Sea and the crossing of the Jordan River, he actually doesn't say it, or state it rather. He asks it as questions. Have another look. Was the Lord displeased against the rivers? Right? Was his anger against the rivers? Why did God do this? Did the sea wrong him? Did the river do something sinful that deserved God's wrath? Is that why he stopped the river in its place? Is that why he stopped the sea being able to flow in its natural course? No. So he's prompting people to think, well, why has God done all that he did? Why is God doing this? And the clearest point throughout the passage we see that, it's very clear in verse 13. You went forth for the salvation of your people. Every one of the events describe how God wielded his mighty power for Israel's salvation. God revealed himself to Israel. He fought for Israel on the battlefield. He miraculously provided for Israel's needs. And probably the most incredible thing God did was continue to chastise Israel and bring them back to himself despite their continued disobedience and turning from him, as we see in the story of Gideon there. God was faithful to the covenant between himself and Israel, even when Israel was not. And of course, we know that salvation is not just for Israel, though. Okay, for God brought Israel for you and I as well through Jesus. And we know that Jesus came from Israel. So by protecting Israel, God was also protecting the future salvation that you and I enjoy today. Okay, and you can see there's actually a little reference for that. I don't know if you noticed when we went through it the first time. Even for salvation with your anointed. Okay, his anointed is Jesus. So there's actually a future, looking forward here in this prophecy as well. How incredible to know that God's so powerful that he can raise up and annihilate nations, so powerful that nature itself obeys God, so powerful that he can change a nation's heart, a person's heart. How incredible it is to know that this God loves you to the point that he will wield his mighty power for your salvation. That he will continue to turn your heart back to him. And all of this comes from, we know this because we know and understand God's character. We know God, we know who he is. Okay, now there's more to God, of course, than just the three that I've listed there. Those three I think were most prominent throughout the hymn. Of course, his power was on display throughout all of those events, but also his faithfulness to his chosen people and his love for them in turning their hearts back towards himself. And it's when we have this correct knowledge and understanding of God and his love and his saving power and his faithfulness to us that we can continue to walk in love, continue to become more like him as we get to know Christ and to serve him better. Now, to help just reinforce these materials of faith, these foundational building blocks of our faith, I just want to point out that Habakkuk didn't just decide that these might be useful. Right? What Habakkuk has done is he's actually described to Judah, I mentioned it before, those things that he learned in his discussions. He's just repeating the lesson that God taught him. So these three foundations of faith, we actually see throughout the whole book, not just in chapter 3. Right? We see that, firstly, Habakkuk struggled to reconcile God's character with what he saw around him. He knew God's character, and so he knew something wasn't right. And God clarified his character for him, that he may continue to walk in faith, that he might know, yes, God is faithful, yes, God is mighty, and yes, he will continue to work for the good of those he loves and who love him. We see, of course, that in order to determine or to figure out what was going on, in order to reconcile God's character, he went to God in prayer. Humble, patient prayer. Asking God what's going on. And of course, as he learned of God's judgment against sin, he developed, rightly so, a clear and wise fear of God. These were the lessons that Habakkuk learned and that he now passes on to the others. So having now instilled these three materials of faith through this psalm, Habakkuk looks to conclude. And it's at this point that I'd like to remind us of chapter 2, verse 4, which is kind of the central verse for the whole book, where he says that the righteous will live by his faith. Okay, it's all to do with people's faith here. So having now hopefully strengthened people's faith, he aims to conclude by showing people what it is to live by their faith, as chapter 2, verse 4 says. So we've already read some of verse 16 before. When I heard, summarizing here, when I heard, my belly trembled, my lips quivered at the voice, rottenness entered into my bones, and I trembled in myself. So he's reminding them that he was fearful of God's judgment that's coming. But he feared that I might rest in the day of trouble when the Chaldeans will come upon us. I got to admit, when I first read that, I was confused. You're saying, I fear so that I might rest in the day of trouble. Hopefully, if we recall some of the things we talked about regarding the fear of God earlier, we can hopefully make sense of this. Okay, we spoke earlier about how the fear of God turns us to God, firstly in repentance. We also spoke, of course, that the purpose of God's judgment on Judah was to turn their hearts back to God in repentance as well. And we know that God is the Savior of Israel. He protects and saves his chosen people. Okay, all those events that we read tell us of that. So you're going to be one of two people when God's judgment comes. You're either going to be one of those people in Judah who have turned their back on God. And so as that judgment comes, it comes and it comes hard. Okay, and it will be painful and it will be tough and it will turn your heart to God. Or you'll be someone who has repented. See, Habakkuk has already turned back to God. His heart is to God and he's hoping to turn other people's hearts back to God before the judgment comes. For he knows that those who are faithful to God, who walk according to God's laws, God will serve and protect and love and carry through that hard time. Now the hard time will still come. That judgment's coming for all Judah. But he will protect and preserve a remnant of faithful people as he always does. So will you be one who, when the judgment comes, it'll be a surprise and it will hit hard for your sins have been found out? Or will you repent that when judgment comes, you'll be secure in your position in Christ? See, Habakkuk knows that because he's already repented and that God is his Savior, God will take him through and carry him through the hard times ahead. All starting from the fear of God. So I feel like he skipped a few bits in the middle there. But from fear of God, turn to repentance, turn to faith in God, where he knows that God will carry him through and that he can rest easy. And then Habakkuk expresses this hope and this faith that he has beautifully. We'll read verses 17 to 19. Although the fig tree shall not blossom, neither shall fruit be in the vines, the labor of the olive shall fail, and the fields shall yield no meat. The flock shall be cut off from the fold, and there shall be no herd in the stall. Yet I will rejoice in the Lord. I will be joyful in the God of my salvation. The Lord God is my strength, and he will make my feet like hinds' feet or deer's feet, and he will make me to walk upon my high places. I don't think much needs to be said about that. Despite all that might come upon me, despite all that might happen around me, still I will rejoice in God. For you have granted me salvation. You have given me hope. And you in all your mighty power and love will work all things to bring me into a closer relationship with you and to make me more like you, to grow my love for you. Hopefully when you see Habakkuk's response there, surely you desire to have this response yourself. So how do we build and nurture our faith so we might have this kind of response to all that might happen in our lives? Start by praying. That's where Habakkuk started. Spend time talking with God. Bring your questions to him. Bring your concerns to him. Bring your praise to him. He's a good, mighty God that's done mighty things for us too. Ask God to help you to see your sin as how truly terrible that it is. Ask God to help you to understand his holiness and righteousness and goodness. And ask God to help you to understand the terrible judgment that he will bring upon sin and sinners, and the discipline that he brings upon his people as well. And ask God that he would help you to understand all that is written in his word. See, how do we know God's character? Well, we wouldn't know anything unless he told us, but God has told us. Right? We've learned some of God's character today by reading Habakkuk. There's a lot more books in here than just Habakkuk. Ask God to help you to understand what he has said to you through his word. Help us to know all that we need to know about you, God. Okay? Help us to know about ourselves, sin, forgiveness, the world, heaven, hell, and everything that I haven't listed. If you want to know God's character, prayerfully read what he's written to you. Meditate on it and believe and trust in it and in him, that he will always wield his mighty power out of love and faithfulness to his people, that is you and I, to bring us through all things in this life and to eventually have eternal joy. We won't just have joy in this life, we'll have eternal joy with him forever. Let's pray. God, thank you so much for teaching us. Thank you for humbling us. God, as we look to you, our Savior, our mighty Savior, God, we pray that you will continue to turn our hearts toward you, that you would instill in us a fear of your judgment and of your discipline, that we might continue along in the right path that you have set before us. God, help develop in us a deeper love for you, born out of the faith that you instill in us through prayer, through knowing you as our personal God and Savior. Help us to continue faithfully this week and forever. Amen.